right, welcome to the Religious Treehouse. This is episode 20. I'm excited for that. I am your co-host Matthew. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm Jody, and I'm your other co-host, and I'm so excited to be at our 20th episode.
No, me too. This is great. Um, I was not sure if we were going to make it this far, but I'm still having fun, so this is great. How's your week been going since we've talked last?
My week's great. I just got a new job. I'm going to be working
Ooh,
with puppies. I
good.
love me some dog time.
You do love animals.
I really do. How's your week going, Matthew?
It is going great. I have not gotten a new job, but I've been reading about the Exodus, and that's fun. Which is what our episode's about today. I think we're going to be doing a handful of episodes in the Book of Exodus, but I figured we'd start at the beginning of Exodus and kind of walk through Moses. I think more so we're focusing on Moses and his kind of origins here, rather than the book Exodus. But yeah, I'm excited for this. We're doing the first four chapters of Exodus, which kind of it's the introduction to Moses and a few of the baselines of what's going on there. So, Jody, do you want to start us off with a nice summary of Exodus 1 through 4?
Yeah, and I'll try to keep this brief. Brief. So you know that guy Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat we talked about last week. How fun is it that that kind of leads into this episode? But he and all of his family have moved to Egypt. They die. A lot of people die, but at the same time, that their population is bigger than ever. The Israelites are so strong in numbers right now, but they are under a new king who has no idea who Joseph is. And he's like, you know what, we need to start killing baby boys. And then there's a baby boy that isn't killed, and he's floated down a river, and he is given the name Moses, which is an Egyptian name to know. And then Moses does a very bad thing and has to leave Egypt and runs for the hills. And there he meets this really nice priest guy and his daughters. And while he's out tending this guy's sheep, he stumbles upon a bush, and he and the bush have a nice conversation that leads Moses to head.
So, chapter 2, we are introduced to the house of Levi, and a Levi man and a Levite woman have a baby, and they hid him for 3 months because
Yeah,
of, oh, okay.
are we tracking these families? Like, are they tracking each other in Egypt?
Yeah. So, the different tribes are very important and they come up often. We saw this in Judges. Um, like each judge is kind of attributed to a different tribe. So that's what's happening here. We've got 13 tribes, generally speaking, ish. 12 tribes of Israel are going to be all of Jacob's sons, except for Joseph. Joseph's two sons act as two other tribes. And then we also have the tribe of Levi, who's kind of the priestly tribe. And we kind of get the origins of Levi being the priestly tribe through this narrative that we're going to be talking about today. But yeah, the idea of them being associated with a certain tribe of Israel is very important.
But there's 13 tribes.
Yeah.
There's 12 tribes, and then the Levi tribe.
Right. It gets complicated. But the Levite tribe, like if you look at maps of ancient Israel in the time of like Joshua or something, you're going to see you're probably going to see 12 different land masses of some sort, and you might not see one with Levi. There might not be a Levite land mass. And that's generally because the Levites were the priestly class and they did priestly activities.
Okay. Okay.
And
So they roam.
they're kind of intermixed. It's complicated. This was a bad. This was like, don't quote me on this. This was not a great summary of what's going on here. We can talk about the different tribes of Israel at some other point, but for the most part, what we should know here is how these tribes were classified, and there's national attachments to their tribe. So
Okay.
that's what we should note. And then the tribe of Levi is considered the priestly tribe, especially from the P source, the priestly source. We get big thumbs up for the tribe of Levi, especially Aaron in the priestly source.
Okay. But so, but for this podcast, it's important to know Moses is born of the Levi tribe.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So
And
Moses
also
is born.
Aaron, but we haven't gotten
And
to Aaron yet.
we haven't gotten to Aaron. We'll get to Aaron and my beef with him in a little. So she has the baby, she bears a son, and he was a fine baby, it says. And she had him for 3 months.
Yeah, okay. So that's an interesting translation choice. I think, what does it say? The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. It's a fine translation, but what the word that we have here is he was a good baby. I think this is an intentional callback to Genesis 1. It could be at least, where, and it was good. Like we're setting up Moses as through his birth narrative here, we're saying, hey, this Moses dude, he's like top of the line. He's a good baby. Like two thumbs up. We're noting Moses as an important figure here. And also, like miscarriages and unhealthy pregnancies at this time, we could assume were fairly common. So this is also saying like Moses was fine. He was okay. But I think the word tov, I think gets ignored in this translation, whereas in Genesis 1, we see tov being repeatedly called good, good. It kind of gets skimmed over here.
Okay, so she had a baby and it was good.
Yeah, yeah.
And when she could hide him no longer, Mama made a basket. And Mama
Mhm.
put the basket in a river. And I'm going to need someone to show me a basket in a river with a baby.
I we talked about this yesterday, and I don't get your confusion. Like it's a boat. Like these are boats. You've seen boats, right?
I've seen a boat.
And you've seen people on boats, right?
I've seen people on
Now
boats.
imagine smaller, a small
Okay,
person, also known as like a baby, on a smaller boat.
babies wiggle around, man. Babies wiggle and jiggle and are fussy. 3 months old. You're telling me that she put this baby in a basket and floated it down the river and it didn't sink or tip over.
Yeah. Okay. So the word here is also the same word as ark in the story of Noah's flood. So the idea of it's a boat without like a rudder or anything like that is kind of the idea here. And like I feel like it's pretty easy to put a baby, maybe wrap them up in something and like say, okay, go with the current baby.
I am wrong. She placed it among the reeds. That's important. Okay, when I show
Yeah.
you Prince of Egypt, it shows him floating down the river and it's very concerning. Oh, but placed among the reeds, that makes sense. I can accept that. I can accept it being placed among the reeds.
Yeah.
Um, do we know what river is that important? In the movie, it's always the Nile River.
I mean, I assume it's the Nile. I don't know if it's mentioned. The Nile plays a big role in this story. So, I mean, I guess it doesn't necessarily say Nile, but we can assume. But I don't think that's too important. But I think this is an intentional tie back to the Noah story. The idea that we have kind of this new creation, this new starting mode coming out of the ark, I think is an intentional correlation we have between the two stories.
And his sister stands at a distance to see what would happen to him, but we don't get a name for the sister yet.
Right, right. Right. Okay, so you're assuming this is Miriam, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and I think this is what we have another example of conflicting sources, where later sources, I think the first time we get Miriam named is in Exodus 15. And in some sources, we see Miriam as being, I think she's most often identified as Aaron's sister, and Aaron is identified as Moses's brother. Sometimes Aaron is identified as like Moses's pal. Like it gets confusing based on the sources. We have this idea of it's all this one combined narrative, so it's hard to kind of distance ourselves from each different strand. But yeah, like it's this sister is often identified as Miriam, but I don't think we can necessarily assume that this is Miriam if we want to look at these sources differently. And I hate that I'm talking so much about these sources when we haven't ever like done like a big intro to it. But maybe if we talk about it enough, we'll figure it out as we go.
I think it's good to incorporate in now because as I'm learning more, I'm realizing I should be noting more. So
Mm.
if you're not enjoying Matthew going into it, write him hate mail. He wants it.
I would
He's
love hate
asking
mail.
for it.
I would love hate mail.
He's
Email
asking
us,
for it.
thereligioustreehouse@gmail.com. Give me your complaints. I would love to hear it.
So the sister isn't named, and then the daughter of the Pharaoh is not named, but she comes down to the river to bathe with
Mhm.
her attendants. And we've clarified between Matthew and I, these attendants we're assuming slaves.
Yeah, we're assuming these are enslaved workers,
Okay.
just as we can assume they are.
Yeah. She sends her maid to bring her the basket. She opens it. She sees a child and she's like, oh, it must be one of the Hebrews' children. And my question is, how does she know it is a Hebrew child?
Right. And it's not explicitly mentioned. It's like we can't know for sure. But I think the general assumption is that Moses was circumcised. And we're like, okay, therefore he's a Hebrew.
Very heavy penis undertones in this story because and it's an undertone because it's not explicitly stated, but it's there. Like
Yeah.
she knows he's Hebrew. Later in the story, he knows he's Hebrew. And how does he
Yeah.
know he's Hebrew?
Right. Yeah. So we can assume that might be it. And it could be other reasons too. Who knows? But my first gut reaction to answering that question is, oh, he's circumcised. Probably. And that's probably the what's going on here.
And then his sister comes out of the reeds and says, shall I go and fetch a maid for you? It's very like the sister kind of like was really doing him a solid there. And I feel is a more important character that she should be named because she basically was able to get Moses back with his mom so he could continue to nurse.
Yeah. Yeah. Is his mom named either? I don't think
Nope.
so. Not yet. I think we get that later. But
I didn't even know his mother had a name.
yeah. So who knows? The story goes on. As it is often in the Bible, the women get kind of shunted to the side, and we follow the stories of the men with like one or two exceptions.
Yeah. But she takes his mother, gets him, nurses him, raises him a little bit more, and then returns him to the Pharaoh's daughter.
Mm,
And he becomes her son, and she names him Moses because she
yeah.
drew him out of the water. Moses is an Egyptian name.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like the Hebrew word to mean like one who draws out, drawn out of the water. So that's kind of the pun going on there. But Moses is an Egyptian name. And so there's an Egyptian pharaoh named Tutmos, I think, if I'm getting that right. And we can kind of like the ending of that Mose, we see that as being part of the Egyptian word. So that's meaning son of the deity Tut or something like that, which is probably the Egyptian origins of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. But yeah, the fact that we have Moses having an Egyptian name, being the one who's like leading all the Israelites out of Egypt, I think is kind of interesting. And it gives more credence to why people would think Moses is Egyptian because he has an Egyptian name.
And he's clothed now, so they can't
Yeah.
tell automatically that he's
Right.
Hebrew. He
Right.
has on pants.
Yeah.
Um, but it's very interesting to me that, these two, because once he's given to the Pharaoh's daughter, he's essentially royalty.
No, he's
And
like a prince at this point.
he's a
Like we can
prince.
assume that to some extent.
And you're seeing kind of what happens between the Matthew and the Luke, Jesus birth narratives, with Matthew was giving more of a, oh, he is going to be he's divine and
Mm-hmm.
blessed and royalty on earth. And then in the Luke narrative, it was like he's very humble and it was very humble beginnings, born in a manger. And you're seeing
Yeah.
both of those things within the first part of chapter 2 with Moses.
Yeah.
Like he's born humbly of Hebrews and then elevated to the status of a prince by being adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter.
Yeah, the Luke narrative draws on Moses less than Matthew does. So I think Matthew is drawing a lot on this story. So we can definitely see the ties there. Um, but yeah, there is kind of interesting dichotomy that interpreters can have fun with.
But Moses grows up. Also, another thing I'm kind of noting here, it's like that gap of like the Jesus years. Like
Yeah,
when did they don't know where Jesus went, like he just came back and he was 33. And we have that kind of same gap here with Moses. Like he grows up and
yeah.
he's an adult now.
We don't care about what happened in that time period. Like we got the birth down, that's important, and then he does important stuff. We'll care about that.
I'm just saying I want the missing teen years. I want the angst. I want
Yeah,
puberty.
yeah. There's oh, referring back to Jesus. I didn't know we'd be talking about Jesus so much this episode.
Sorry.
there's a book called Lamb, The Missing Gospel of Biff. It's a hilarious book. Like, and it's like shouldn't be taken seriously by any means, but it kind of like imagines Jesus's teen years. Um, Funny. If you're interested in a funny read, that's and you're not too offended by uh, making jokes about the Bible, it's real funny, and I highly recommend it. It's like a kid's book. It was written by like a kid's author. It's not a kid's book by any means. Certainly not a kid's book, but it's written by an author that does. I forget his name, but he does some like children's books. So it's like a real easy read, real funny. That's a side point.
I want that with Moses because, in the Prince of Egypt, they give you a chariot race between Moses and Ramses II. I need to make you watch this movie. They're teenage boys. Like they're doing teenage boy-y things. It's fun. But he grows up, he goes out to see his people, and he sees them being forced to labor. What are they laboring on is not named. So
Yeah, probably not the pyramids, as I know you want that to be.
I
Uh,
didn't say that's what I want it to be. I was saying that that is the narrative I hear.
yeah, there's nothing here that implies it's the pyramids that they're working on. There's a lot more that happens in Egypt than pyramids, despite us associating Egypt almost exclusively with pyramids. So there's other stuff happening that they need forced labor for.
Yeah, but we don't get any definitive on what that is. But what we do know is Moses becomes a murderer because he kills one of the taskmasters for beating
Yeah.
on a Hebrew. And he was like, "Those are my people. I know because," and then he looks down.
I feel like you're real caught up on this whole circumcision thing, but
Because it isn't like stated how they know. But that's now that I know that that's how they knew, it's Freudian. It's in my brain.
yeah, and yeah, for sure. But yeah, it's well, we have to go back to Genesis and to the Abraham story to talk about the origins of this. But yeah, circumcision comes up fairly often in, especially in the Torah, at least.
Yeah.
But yeah, he tries to sneak his way through and say, "Oh, I murdered this guy," but hopefully no one saw. And then two Hebrew servants or enslaved workers are like, "Ooh." And they were fighting, and they're like, "Oh, what are you gonna do? Kill us like the Egyptian dude that you killed?" And Moses is like, "Oh no, I've been found out. I got to dip."
Well, yeah, of course they were going to threaten him. They're all like, "You're a prince. We saw what you did. We
Yeah,
don't know you're one of us. We just know your name is Moses and you killed someone." How
yeah,
dare.
yeah. And there's the text implies less of a class difference in the criticism. Like it's not so much like a um, the enslaved workers against the priestly Moses. Uh, this seems to be much more of a nationality difference: the Israelites versus the Egyptians, and that seems to
Okay.
be the underlying tension that this text is exploring.
I'm not going to say what's in my head because I don't want to be accused of thinking about this more than I should. So he flees from Pharaoh and he settled in the land of Midian and sat down by a well.
Yeah,
He was over on the bench. Um, and 7 girls roll up, the priests of Midian. They have their flock of sheep. Some shepherds come and try to drive them away, which is like rude. Like,
yeah,
y'all are working in the same industry here. We must share resources. Moses gets up and comes to their defense. So he's not all bad. I mean, in terms of a justified murder, I think what happened to the taskmaster, because he was beating on a Hebrew guy, it's justified. So, in this chapter, we get Moses doing a bad thing and Moses doing a good thing. He's a dichotomy, ladies. He has two sides.
he contains multitudes.
Contains so good.
Yeah. But yeah, so eventually their father, who was the priest of Midian, uh,
Ruel.
Ruel, as it's told in this chapter, calls Moses back and he's like, "Hey, here's my daughter Zipporah. You guys should marry." And they're like, "Cool," and they get married. And like Moses is cool. He's in his land doing his stuff now, chilling in Midian.
And she bears him
He
a son named Gershom.
Yeah, Gershom refers to like a foreigner or alien or something like that. Stranger in a strange land. You hear that a lot with the Moses narrative. So that's what's happening here with his name. A lot of these names have fun puns. I feel like we've talked about that a lot. Zipporah, I think, means bird, which I don't know. But all of these names have fun little connections that are intentional. Like, and that gives more rise to the idea that these stories may not necessarily be historical because, like, oh, these names have intentions, or like they have these names, so we've concocted these stories around it to make sense of their names, which is a possibility. So again, the Bible is not a history book. It's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah. So, and then after a long time, the king of Egypt dies. Again, he's not named. And the Israelites groan under their slavery when earlier in chapter 1 they moaned.
Yeah.
And you had noted this because there is a similarity there. Like in the moaning and the groaning and the way that they cry for help.
Yeah, I think it's like verse 1, 13 through 14, and chapter 2, 23 through 25. Like, I think, though, if I remember right, those are generally identified as the same source with differing sources in between them. And we can kind of, if you read just those two verses together, you can kind of feel a connection even in the English.
And finally, God hears their groaning and remembers his covenant with them and with Abraham,
Mm.
Isaac, and Jacob. And is like, oh, I'm going to notice that.
Yeah. Yeah. And the role that God plays in these stories differs. Like we see this in Esther, where God's not mentioned at all. Joseph, God doesn't play a huge role in anything happening there. So the idea of God, except when he's dancing with his like margarita and his red glasses in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, but um, God doesn't always play a big role in these stories. A lot of it is this, oh, what can we assume God is doing in behind the scenes and stuff like that. I think that's sometimes the intention. And again, the authors have different relationship and different interpretations and different views of God and how God interacts in the story. So that's important to note as well.
So before we leave chapter 2, I do want to note that there is nothing divine about Moses's birth, from what I've read so far in chapter
Mm.
2. And knowing what I know about what's going to happen, there is no big, there's no dreams. There's, I mean, it is nice that the princess came down and saw him
Mm.
in the reeds, but up until the end of chapter 2, there's no assertion that God is having a hand in placing Moses there for
Yeah.
this specific purpose to go through these specific things so that he is prepared for what lies ahead of him.
Yeah. It's not like Abraham and Sarah having Isaac, where Sarah is barren, and then God's like, okay, fine, you can have Isaac. And it's not like Jeremiah, where God's like, I have the plans for you and all that stuff. And it's certainly not like Jesus, where it's a virgin birth and all that. So yeah, but I think there's still importance. Like we see Moses saying, "This is a good. He's good. She had a son, and he is good." So there's still importance to his birth, but it's not. It follows a few different um, pathways than we've seen in other stories that we've talked about.
Yeah. No, and then I think it's still good because his experiences are what made Moses who he was. Like he did have to go through murdering someone.
Mm.
Um, and he did have to leave Egypt. He did have to get to Midian. He did have to meet Ruel and marry Zephora. Like it does all lead him to where he gets to, but God doesn't notice them in their moaning and groaning until after the king of Egypt dies.
Mm.
So it's not like he had planned it all out, but it all works out. So when we do get into chapter 3, which are you okay switching now?
Chapter 3.
Chapter 3, Moses is keeping flock of his father-in-law Jethro, which the name changes, and
Mm.
we'll talk about in a second, but he's there when there's the bush. Like he is out of there. This man who held a position of power in Egypt, maybe not power, but a prominent position as a prince.
Yeah, no, I think position of power is certainly. I think that's what we're supposed to assume.
Yeah. He is in a position to be visited by God, but to purposefully not have God take notice until the end of chapter 2. And coincidentally, this man who was in position of power is in Midian tending to a flock of sheep.
Mm.
He's all alone. Now I can visit him as a burning bush. Is kind of cool.
Okay, yeah, okay, I see it. I like it. I like where you're going.
Yeah. So, um, but before we continue on, Ruel and Jethro, what's up with that?
Yeah, different sources yet again.
But we couldn't just switch the names so they were like in alignment. They were the same.
What do you mean?
Well, like they are pulling from different sources, but you can just very quickly just like scratch out Ruel, put Jethro, just decide on a name. Or are we
Yeah,
cool with calling him both?
what probably is happening here is we have two different traditions that were brought together, and one has an important tradition regarding Ruel. I'm not too certain what Ruel means. Obviously, it's connected to God in some sort because we end with El, Samuel. We even see this with angels, Michael, Gabriel, Daniel. Like ending with L is a good sign that it refers to God in some way. So there might be some tradition from the Ruel tradition. It's like, okay, we need to keep Ruel. We need to keep him in the story. And then Jethro comes along in a different tradition. We're like, okay, cool. We need to, this is how this tradition treats him. So that's probably why we didn't just scratch out one name and replace it.
Okay. Okay. So both traditions are then being honored.
Yeah.
So, okay. I'm cool with that. Just sometimes inconsistencies in a story get to me.
Yeah. Okay. So this is probably the J and E sources that are typically denoted as J and E. If one of these is the P source, I apologize, and you can completely discard what I'm saying here. But the J and E sources are usually really hard to differentiate from each other. So much so that we're not entirely sure if it's just a J and an E source or if there's a bunch of different sources that are combined together. Again, we'll talk about this in a source episode at some point, I'm sure. But J usually comes from the Southern Kingdom, E comes from the Northern Kingdom, and then they get meshed together as a JE source, which is probably what's happening here. So, because the Northern Kingdom got destroyed and they had to kind of merge with the Southern Kingdom, it's important that those two sources still create a sense of unity and like they still like have the shared story. So we want to kind of keep both traditions alive in some sense.
Okay. Unity without forgetting the origins of
Yeah.
the
And again,
individuals.
I'm simplifying a lot of this, but yeah.
Well, this I'm sorry if you're listening in and you want a really academic view. I'm not sure you're going to get that here because you're simplifying a lot of it for me, and I appreciate the way you explain things because it makes it easy for me, someone without the background that you
Mm.
have, able to understand it. So,
Yeah, no, and I hope that's the goal of this podcast to kind of take a step towards the academic view of these things. Like,
yeah.
I don't want to go spouting off talking as if you're a fellow academic. I want this to be kind of a bridge between, like, okay, I've never heard of the Bible, what's going on here, without completely jumping into, you know, the deep end of academic study. Like, I hope this is a good bridge. And if we follow this conversation along long enough, we can get there and talk about things super academically. But hopefully, yeah, and again, once if I get a PhD, I think it'll be a lot more authoritative of me to speak of the hardcore academic stuff. But right now, I think a good bridge is an empty space in the public spread of religious studies.
Sweetheart, you're doing great. I came in here with a rudimentary biblical knowledge and a love for the Prince of Egypt.
Yeah.
And that is what's driving me most of this episode. And this is it. One of my favorite parts in The Prince of Egypt, which is the burning bush.
Mm,
Okay, it's a bush that burns but is not consumed. And
yeah.
again, setting the scene. There was no divine reason for why Moses was born or where he was placed, but God took notice, saw this dude out in the desert tending to his sheep, and said, I'm going to appear to him as a bush.
Yeah,
It's kind of iconic.
right. And
It
again, I would like to note bush not the same as a tree, but it kind of is. So we have again foliage, and I want to point that out. And that trees are everywhere in the Bible. But
and
it's a good question. Why do we have a bush? It's not really clear. The idea of there being a bush not being consumed by the fire might be intentional to like represent Israel or something, saying like Israel is safe from God's fire and stuff like that. That might be what they're trying to do. Sometimes God is referenced through or is symbolized by Asherah, which is a tree pole. So, like putting God in the lens of a bush or foliage of some sort might be what's going on here. But it's not exactly clear why there's a burning bush and why that's happening.
see, that's so much deeper than my thought because I'm like, he's like thinking, what is the easiest object for me to pop into and talk to this guy? I know I'll set a bush on fire.
Yeah.
And that's like a really rad, like God perspective for me. I'm like, I'm just gonna set this bush on fire and then we'll chill. Then we'll hang.
Yeah. Yeah. Which
Um,
I think happens sometimes. God's like, what would be cool?
and like, like the crackling of flames, like sometimes sounds like a voice, like or a sound, like so. I also just love the use of fire in the Bible. When we ever
Yeah.
get to
And
Shadrach.
fire often like represents a divine presence of some sort. Like we see that fairly often. But yeah.
Yeah. So he makes Moses remove his sandals because he
Mhm.
is in on holy ground,
Yeah.
which the connection to the earth and grounding yourself being a holy thing, I really dig and vibe with.
Maybe. Yeah, that could be it. Um, I think the two other explanations that I found to be more convincing. I mean, I love your interpretation. I think that's fun. I think one might just be you don't want to track dirt into God's holy area. Like that would be kind of like, hey, we don't want to track dirt in. But second, it might not be ritually pure to bring your sandals into the divine area. Like sandals, if you think of it, probably made of leather or animal products of some sort, and it's generally not considered clean to like touch dead animals and stuff like that. So they might have this trace of uncleanliness, and that might be what's going on here. And I think if we look at the priestly vestments, like what priests wear when going into the temple, we see this later in Exodus. I could be wrong here. Someone fact check me, but I don't think any shoes are prescribed. So I think it's common to think of not wearing shoes as being holy.
Well, yeah, to ground yourself to the earth. I don't think the burning bush was concerned with him tracking in dirt, seeing as the bush was in dirt.
Yeah, right. And I
Like,
think the tracking in dirt much more applies to uh, the tabernacle and temple and stuff like that. But yeah, there's definitely something happening there.
well, yeah, but also like to remove that barrier between you and the ground that you walk on, the ground that you come from, this holy ground, and be
Mm-hmm.
connected to me. Because that's what's connecting Moses in the bush once his shoes are off, is the ground. The bush is planted in the ground, and his bare feet are now touching the ground. So
Mm-hmm.
that energy can run straight in between them. It is a conduit of energy, the ground between the bush and Moses. That's just how I'm seeing it right now.
Yeah, no, I think you'd be interested in ecological readings of the Bible. I think that would tickle your fancy, and
Yeah.
there's fun things to read about that for sure.
And so Moses is introduced to God.
Mm-hmm.
I am the God of your father. I am the God of Abraham. I am the God of Isaac. I am the God of Jacob. And then Moses hides his face. He was afraid to look at God. Is that a shame thing you think because of the murdering or just reverence?
Maybe I think it's more so and we see this in Greek mythology and stuff like that too. Like you can't look on the divine form. Like looking on like it's just so powerful it'll like melt you away. Like you can't look at the divine form. So I think that's kind of what's happening here because I don't think we ever see. I don't think any. I could be wrong. I don't think anywhere in the Bible do we see someone directly looking at God's divine form. Um, However that may be, however that's described. I mean, we see God um, present God's self in some form or another. We see God wrestle with Jacob, or messenger. That's a whole other story. We see a divine figure wrestle with Jacob. In Habakkuk, we see God walking among the earth. In Genesis 2 and 3, we see God walking around. But like that's kind of different than like God's divine form. The closest we get might be with Moses up on Mount Sinai, looking at it's sometimes translated as looking at God's back or looking at where God was. So, and then at that, Moses has to shield his face because it's shining so much.
And thank you for noting the Mount Sinai thing. I forgot to say he is on Mount Horeb, the
Yeah,
mountain of God, which is also Mount Sinai.
yeah. It's sometimes referred to as Mount Sinai. It gets confusing.
Which is the mountain he will eventually come back to get the 10 Commandments. So it's
Yeah,
important that he's getting this first message here.
yeah. And Bush in Hebrew. Oh my goodness, it's I should know this off the top of my head. This should just be a thing that I'm like, oh yeah, this is Bush. Um, oh my goodness.
He was over by the bush.
Senah, yeah. So the bush means Senah, or in Hebrew is Seneh, Senah, something like that, which probably corresponds to Sinai in some way or another.
So he's on the holy mountain of God, having this energetic exchange with the bush. And he's hiding away from the bush, which yes, I get the divine form thing, but also he knows it's a burning bush.
Yeah.
He knows for sure he's not there in his divine form. So to still hide his face away feels like there's another reason. But I
Well, I
digress.
mean, God, I think it explicitly mentions God in the bush. Like, God is there. I think that's what, I think that's the implied. At first, we see an angel of God or a messenger of God um, initiating the conversation, which sometimes there's a correlation between God and God's messengers or minor deities that kind of get absorbed into God in these views of God. So the idea of who exactly is talking to Moses isn't exactly clear until like it's explicitly says, "Hey, this is God talking." But I think the idea is that like, hey, God is present in the bush.
Okay. Yeah, because it says God called to him out of the bush.
Yeah, yeah.
Now I'm imagining a little glowing orb inside the
Mhm.
burning bush saying, "Hey, over
Yeah. Well,
here."
that's how the Ten Commandments kind of portrays it. Uh, Cecil B. DeMille's version. And interestingly, I think this is also true for Prince of Egypt. I've never seen that one, but the actor that plays Moses almost always plays the voice of God, and I think that's an interesting choice by the director, by the actor. I think that's I don't know. I think there's something weird happening there, but we'll talk about that. I'm sure you'll make me watch Prince of Egypt at some point, and we'll talk about it on this podcast.
For sure, buddy. So the Lord then addresses and says, "Hey, I've seen everything happening to my people in Egypt. I know their sufferings. I want to bring them out of that to a land oozing with milk and honey."
Yeah, flowing with milk and honey is the common way you'll hear it. I prefer the translation oozing with milk and honey.
Ugh,
I think that fits it a little bit better.
ugh.
Meaning it's prosperous. There's good stuff there. Like it's a
I know.
great
I get
land.
that. I hear the word ooze and I think of pus.
Yeah.
And that's a me thing. That's not a you thing. But he now wants to take them to this land that has all of these other people in it. Should I name all of them?
No, it's just a big land of a lot of people. The land of Canaan is how it's often referred, just shortly. Like the land
And
of Canaan. Woo.
God now wants to send Moses to bring his people out of Egypt away from Pharaoh.
Yeah.
And Moses is like, "Who am I to do that? Like,
Yeah.
why me?" Again, because his birth was not divine. He has just been going through life. He's just tending to his flock, my guy. And now you have him shoes off in the desert telling him to go back to Egypt where he killed the man
Mm.
and confront probably someone he knows, is like the assumption. Because whoever
I mean,
took over,
maybe. Well, no, I think intentionally mentions that the king died. That's why he can go back there. So the idea that he confronts people that he knows, I don't think is too big of a problem.
No, you don't think so? It is in the Prince of Egypt. And you shall serve God on this mountain.
Yeah, which is a sign. And this is kind of the archetypal, the prototype of the prophetic call narrative. We talked about this a little bit in Jonah, but the prophetic call narrative usually follows a 6-step structure where we get the divine confrontation, where God's like, "Hey, Moses, Moses, listen to me here," and then we get an introductory word where God's like, "Here I am, come no closer, remove your sandals," and then we get the commission where God tells Moses, "I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." We get the objection where Moses is like, "Who am I? Who am I?" God reassures Moses where God says, "I'll be with you." And then we get a sign of some sort. And the sign in this case is, "You will serve God on this mountain." That's going to be the sign. And this kind of acts as the prototypical prophetic call narrative. Even though Moses isn't directly called a prophet until I think Deuteronomy. But we think of Moses kind of being the ideal prophet.
Which is so funny because he killed a man.
Yeah.
Like, Jonah hadn't done anything wrong up until he decided to ignore God.
Right.
And
Well, yeah, we also didn't hear much of Jonah's story.
true, true. You know what? Jonah could have been a philanderer and been stealing from everyone. We don't know.
Yeah.
But to set up this murderer as this man of God who is going to deliver all of these people from Egypt is a choice.
But
But
yeah,
and
and then we get into the story of the divine name, right?
yes,
Which is exciting and important. Um, because this is where source criticism gets really confusing because the e-source that uses Elohim now begins using the divine name. So at this point forward, it's like what's going on. It's even harder to figure out who gets who we get these sources from, but that's a whole other conversation. We get the divine name of God. Woo, we're buddy buddy with God. That's what's happening here. We know God's name. And then we get famously the "I am who I am," which is not God saying his name, or "I will be what I will be," however you want to translate that. It's a funky way to translate it. It's a hard verse to translate, which is probably punning on the divine name in some sort. But it's not until the later verse after that where God says, "The Lord, the God of your ancestors." Anytime you see the Lord in Hebrew in small caps, that denotes the divine name, and that's where we get God telling Moses what their divine name is.
yeah. So he is who he is. I am who I am.
Yeah.
And that's supposed to be all good. That's supposed to be how Moses tells people. Like they're
Yeah.
supposed to believe him based on that.
Yeah. Well, for the most part, I think next we kind of get like Moses being like, "What if they don't believe me? How do we handle that?" And this is when we get a few magic tricks from Moses or from God through Moses that hopefully will work to some extent. All right.
Yep.
Do you have any other thoughts on the name of God? Like this is like one of the biggest sections of the Bible.
I
I feel like
know
we're
it
just kind of
is.
skirting by it.
I know, I understand, but like it's something that is settled in my soul
Yeah.
already. It's something um
I think we've talked about it on a previous episode too.
yeah,
So
we talked about it a few times and I don't know why. It's just something that I'm like, yeah, I
yeah.
accept this is the conversation. These are the things I know. I mean, it is interesting that he's there was a change in it was the e-source using
Yeah.
Elohim to then
I think
use
so. I
something
could be
else.
mistaken there, but yeah.
But like that is a choice. But I, like Moses got the name. He
Yeah.
secured the bag.
Yeah, for sure. Leave any questions about the divine name in the comments if you have them.
I
Audience.
don't even know what questions you would ask.
Well, hopefully we'll find out.
Hopefully, because
But yeah,
Jody has none.
we kind of get to the point now where God is like, here's a few things that you could do if you don't believe them. And God says, throw the staff on the ground, it'll turn into a snake, pick it back up, it'll be back in your staff. Cool magic trick. Next, we put a hand in the cloak, it comes out all diseased, put it back in, it's all healed. Cool magic trips. Cool magic trick. Then we get some water from the Nile and kind of drip it, and it turns into blood. Gross magic trick, but cool magic trick.
And you're just really skipping over the fact that the staff turned into a snake, which is supposed to be an example that God is with Moses. And people like to
Yeah.
demonize the snake in Genesis. So,
Yeah, I mean it happens. It happens a handful. This isn't anything new, Jody. This happens like three different times
oh, okay.
in the upcoming like 5 chapters.
All
This
right.
is no big news, Jody. Come on, a staff turns into a snake. You see that every other day, don't you?
It seems very important to note that the snake can be used to
Yeah.
prove God's presence, you know?
No, this yeah, the snake has a variety of ways to be interpreted for sure. But this is most likely looking forward to the 10 plagues of Egypt, where we see Aaron doing this staff trick in I think chapter 7. I could be wrong there. And then the water also in the Nile also turns to blood. So this seems to be a precursor to the 10 plagues, which I think we'll have an episode on in a few weeks, and we can talk more about that then.
Yep.
Cool. And then Moses again objects and is like, "Oh no, me no talk so well. I can't make good sound." So God's like, "What about your buddy Aaron?" I think this is your brother Aaron. We identify Aaron as the brother here.
Yes.
I could be wrong, but we get Moses's brother Aaron being the one who speaks for Moses, and this is his introduction to the story.
Yeah. Aaron's name is just coming out of nowhere here. That like it's
Yeah,
really just coming from God being like, "Oh, and your brother Aaron."
yeah,
This isn't. I don't think I've heard of this as the Moses and Aaron story. Like I know Aaron plays a big part,
yeah.
but it it's always Moses. Have you heard the story of Moses? Never have you heard the story of Moses and his tag along brother Aaron?
Yeah, again, in different sources, Aaron plays different roles. In the priestly source, Aaron is definitely lifted up as being very good. Like Aaron is the man. We really like Aaron. In the other sources, Moses is much more preferred, and Aaron is kind of shunted to the side a little bit. But we get Aaron here, and this is
Oh,
great. We love our guy Aaron. He is the Levite. He is the first priest for the temple, and we get that later in Exodus.
I have a divine name question.
Uh oh.
Why I don't I think maybe I pass over it because I really just don't understand like pass over. I don't understand why him saying I am who I am or saying the name. Like
Mhm.
is it built up within the society? Like I guess Moses wouldn't know it because he wasn't raised.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what that's kind of the explanation of why
Okay.
God has to tell Moses his name because he was raised Egyptian. Um, and so the idea is that Moses is an Israelite, is Hebrew, but he was raised Egyptian, which is I think the explanation for why Moses wouldn't know God's name yet in some sources. In other sources, this is the first time we get God's name ever. And it's like, okay. And then whenever we read back Genesis that uses God's name loosey goosey, it's like, okay, it's because we know it from this moment.
So like would none of the Egyptians would know, but all of the Israelites would know. And so like when he went to them and said God's name, then they would know he was one of them.
Maybe the time frame is all wonky here because again, this is a literary
Yeah.
tradition where when we're reading, we already know what's going to happen. We already know the future,
Yeah.
but how it's understood back then because like Moses could know because the priest of Midian, it's not entirely evident what religion, and we can't really define religion back then how we would now, but it's not exactly clear whose God the priest of Midian's is. There's reasons to believe that it might be the same God of the Israelites based on this story, but it's not necessarily evident. So it's an interesting story that I think might be good to dive into at another
Okay. But there, I had a question. I
time.
just wanted to prove to you that I could think of a question.
Perfect.
So yeah, so Moses needs his tag along brother Aaron to speak for him because Moses knows speaking so good, even though
Yeah.
I'm assuming he was educated with the rest of the Egyptian children.
Yeah. Well, the idea is often that he might have a list of some sort. He might talk really quietly. Um, it's not exactly clear why he doesn't speak so well. I do remember when I translated these verses like a year ago, year and a half ago. So I don't remember exactly, but I do remember uh, this exact this section where God's like me no, or where Moses is like me no speak no well. It is kind of janky language where it's like kind of not exactly neat. So I think it's kind of like a bad sitcom where they're like trying to be like, oh no, I don't want to go talk because I can't talk. Well, good me. I That might kind of be what's happening here.
Okay. I'm sorry, Moses. I won't make fun of that anymore.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean it is kind of funny. Again, this dude wasn't divinely placed, but he's been given a divine like role
Yeah.
and he is not equipped.
Right.
Is kind of what he's saying. I'm not equipped for this job. So we kind
Hmm.
of need two men to do it.
Yeah.
I bet the sister could have done it by herself. So, but he goes back to his father-in-law Jethro and says, "Please let me go back to my own people." Do you think he's asking permission because he saved him?
Maybe, but I think he could be asking permission in a sense. But the idea is that Moses got up and left Egypt, and he didn't really bring much with
Hmm.
him. And in order to get the wife Zipporah, he might have like dedicated himself to do kind of labor instead of paying for Zipporah as might be traditional. So that's kind of the explanation that some people have tried to like make sense of this. This is read into the story for sure, but we see this as he leaves the prince of or the priest of Midian. We see that he has a donkey with him, and like when he left Egypt, he didn't really have anything, but when he went back to Egypt, he has a wife now, he has a child now, he has a donkey now, and it kind of is showing how he bumped up in wealth,
And he
probably because
al-
of some servitude to the priest of Midian.
and he also has the staff of God, which is made from a
Tree, perhaps. Is that what you're going for?
yeah, well, why wouldn't it be
Yeah,
a tree? What else would it be?
a
I
snake.
mean, it's made of wood.
Yeah.
It's made of wood, and I don't think they'd find a bush big enough. I'm sorry. I'm just noting that because to note that, like, if it is made of a tree, like, it would
Mhm.
be important that Moses carried basically a tree with him.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I thought you were into this tree stuff. What happened?
Look, no, love the tree stuff. I've just never associated staffs with trees, but maybe I should. Maybe that's a new thing that I can be focusing on.
Yeah. So then the Lord says to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before the Pharaoh and perform all these wonders. I will make this job difficult for you,
Yeah.
and he won't let the people go. So
Yeah. We'll talk more about this in our plagues episode for sure.
yeah.
But
But
yeah.
God warns Moses, like, I'm not making this easy for you, bro.
Yeah.
So here you are going back, a murderer with a speech impediment. I've given you a stick and two other magic tricks, and you need to free my people. That's a tall order.
Yeah. And then on top of that, we get what I would call the weirdest story in the Bible. And I think this weirdest story of the Bible is where we're going to end this conversation at the end of chapter 4, where after God tells Moses, hey, go back to Egypt, go do your thing there, on his way back, God's like, I'm going to kill him for seemingly no reason. It's very unclear what's going on. God, for no clear reason in the text, it's like, I'm going to kill him. This is cool. But then Zipporah comes in clutch, cuts off the tip of their son's penis, places it against his feet,
Whose feet?
whose feet? His. And then all of a sudden, God's like, okay, cool, we're set, we're fine. Do you agree this is a weird story?
Well, yeah, I would have thought they'd already circumcised him.
Well, okay, so let's talk about why. Let's ask, would you say one of the questions you have is why did God try to kill Moses?
Yeah. Yeah, that is why would
One would have
freak
that
out.
question. And there's two reasons I can come up with. One is maybe Moses didn't circumcise uh, his son. And God's like, you got to do that. You got to do that. We need to figure that out. So that's a quick fix by Zipporah. And it's like, all right, cool, we're fine. And placing the foreskin on his feet, probably Moses's, is and the blood is some sort of ritual purity that might be happening here that like appeases God. It might be some ritual that is known to like make God happy. That might be what's going on here. We don't really know. And we should also note that feet is a common euphemism for genitalia. So is Zipporah placing the blood on Moses's feet, or is Zipporah placing the blood on Moses's feet? It's unclear.
I have a lot of feet washing stories to re-examine.
Those mostly come in the New Testament when I don't think that's as common
Okay,
of a
so
metaphor.
that's an Old Testament thing. Like,
It's definitely a Hebrew Bible thing. I don't know enough about New Testament to know for sure. But
okay,
like we'll see like angels in like Ezekiel covering their feet with their wings. And that doesn't mean they're covering their feet with their wings. It means they're covering their genitalia with their wings.
okay.
And we see this in Ruth, as Ruth sleeps at the feet of Boaz. Is that his feet or is that his feet? It's unclear.
Poor Ruth. Poor
um,
Ruth.
but yeah, the other explanation for why God wants to kill Moses is because Moses murdered that dude. And he's like,
Um,
this is a no no. So God is kind of conflicted and like, we need Moses back here to like save these people. But also, Moses needs to be punished for what he did. Because as we learn later in the law, you can't just go around killing people. You shall not murder. And this isn't like a justified war murder where God's much more okay with that. This is kind of killing for vengeance. And God's like, that's a no no. We can't have that. So then Zipporah performs the ritual of some sort to appease God, and then we're all set. And then we're fine. After this, God is chill with Moses for the most part.
so you're saying God had buyer's remorse
Yeah.
and he was like, maybe no, maybe this isn't the way I want to go. Um, but after he does that, he says he talks to Aaron and tells him to
Yeah.
go meet with Moses. You know, he had a contingency plan. He had a backup.
Yeah.
Just Aaron didn't have staff. Moses did.
Mm. And it's also common to kind of send two people to do the job just to be safe. We see this in Joshua, where they send a couple of spies into the land of Canaan, just to like make sure all is good there. Like, so it's not uncommon necessarily for it to be a one man job.
Yeah. I mean, because if one dies, the other can pick up the mantle.
Yeah. So
So
that could be another explanation of what's happening here.
we love a backup plan,
Yeah.
a backup prophet, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. But no, I think I mean, there's a lot we missed. There's a lot we didn't cover, but there's a lot that we did cover in these first four chapters of introducing Moses. So, do you have any other last questions before we close out?
No, I feel I've learned much. I feel like I have created a little confusion on my own end. Nothing that you can't clear up though. So I am very happy with where we have gone on this journey.
Awesome. Me too. Um, if you like this episode, feel free to let us know. If you hated this episode, feel free to let us know. We're on all the social medias. Snapchat, not Snapchat. We're on all the social medias except Snapchat. Does Snapchat
Why,
still exist?
yes, Snapchat still exists, you 65-year-old man.
Sorry, we're not on Snapchat. I don't think we ever will be because yeah. Why does Snapchat still exist? I don't believe in Snapchat. We're
Booty
on
calls.
Instagram. We're on Facebook, we're on X, we're on Bluesky, we're
No, you can't cut. We're on Twitter. Sorry.
we're on X/Twitter. We're on both. We're not on Threads. I have no desire to be on Threads. I don't understand Threads. I don't know why these are the ideas coming to me right now. Follow us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts, and send us an email with your thoughts to thereligioustreehouse@gmail.com.
If you
Thanks
want
for
to send me hate mail, send it to Matthew, please.
perfect. All right. Bye, all.
Bye.